In the midst of the Second World War, as the world's attention was fixed on the battles in Europe and the Pacific, a catastrophe of unimaginable scale unfolded in British India. Between 1943 and 1944, in the province of Bengal, over 3 million people starved to death. They died in villages, on roadsides, and in the streets of Calcutta, their skeletal bodies becoming a common, horrifying sight. This was not a tragedy caused by a simple lack of food. It was a man-made famine, engineered by policy and exacerbated by callous indifference. This event, often omitted from the heroic narratives of the war, would become known as the Bengal Famine. It happened under the watch of one of history's most celebrated figures, Prime Minister Winston Churchill. While he is lauded for saving Europe from one form of tyranny, the evidence reveals a deeply disturbing record of his wartime government's actions in India, actions that directly led to one of the 20th century's worst atrocities. The crisis began in 1942. The Imperial Japanese Army, having swept through Southeast Asia, successfully conquered Burma, a British colony neighboring Bengal. This military defeat was not just a strategic blow. It was an economic catastrophe for India. Burma was the region's rice bowl, and Bengal was heavily dependent on its imports to feed its massive population. With the Japanese now in control of the supply lines, Bengal's primary source of reserve food was severed almost overnight. This single event created a precarious situation, but it did not make famine inevitable. The local harvest in Bengal, while not perfect, was not catastrophic. Had the market been allowed to stabilize, the shortfall could have been managed. But the British War Cabinet, fearing a follow-up Japanese invasion of India, was about to make the situation infinitely worse. Fearing a Japanese landing on the coast of Bengal, the British military command initiated a denial policy. This scorched earth tactic was designed to deny any resources to an invading army. In the coastal areas, the military confiscated and, in many cases, destroyed rice stores, livestock, and other essential supplies. Most catastrophically, they implemented a boat denial scheme, seizing and destroying thousands of civilian boats. In a region defined by its rivers and deltas, these boats were the lifeblood of the local economy. They were how farmers transported rice to markets, how fishermen earned their living, and how supplies moved. By removing the boats, the British government effectively paralyzed the food distribution network, isolating rural populations and creating artificial scarcity. This action, taken in the name of security, was the first step in actively manufacturing the famine. As if the military and import situation were not bad enough, nature dealt a devastating blow. In late 1942, a powerful cyclone and subsequent tidal waves struck Bengal, inundating vast areas of farmland, destroying crops, and killing thousands. This was followed by a severe outbreak of fungal disease in the rice paddies, which further damaged the local harvest. This perfect storm of disasters, the loss of Burma, the denial policy, and the cyclone, created a panic. With food becoming scarce, prices began to skyrocket. Wealthy landowners, merchants, and speculators saw an opportunity for immense profit. They began hoarding massive quantities of grain, withholding them from the market to drive prices even higher. This rampant, unchecked speculation put basic food supplies far beyond the reach of the poor. As millions began to starve, the grain rotted in warehouses, all while the British administration failed to intervene. As the famine ravaged the countryside, a massive, desperate migration began. Tens of thousands of skeletal villagers, carrying their starving children, walked for miles to the city of Calcutta, clinging to the hope that the capital of Bengal would have food. What they found was not salvation, but a different kind of hell. The city streets became a living graveyard. Eyewitness accounts from the period describe emaciated people dying quietly on the sidewalks, with no one having the strength or resources to help them. The municipal government was completely overwhelmed, and the British administration was paralyzed by a mixture of bureaucratic inertia and callous indifference. The scenes were apocalyptic. The dying would beg for the watery scum skimmed from the rice pots of wealthy households. Vultures were seen in the streets, often waiting for the living to die. The administrative failure was total. A limited rationing system had been established in the city, but it was designed to protect the essentials of the war effort: British administrators, soldiers, and workers in war-related industries. The vast, starving, and destitute rural population that had flooded the city was explicitly excluded from this system. They were left to die, visible to all, as the official mechanisms of government simply looked the other way, prioritizing the war machine over the lives of its colonial subjects. While millions starved in Bengal, the ultimate authority rested thousands of miles away in London with Winston Churchill's war cabinet. This cabinet operated on a principle of brutal, total war triage. Every decision, every resource, every cargo ship, and every ton of grain was allocated based on a single, ruthless metric. Did it help defeat Hitler and Imperial Japan? The survival of Great Britain and the success of the upcoming D-Day landings were the only priorities. In this global calculation, the fate of colonial subjects in a distant province was considered an acceptable loss. This mindset meant that while Britain was building a massive surplus of food for its own population in preparation for post-invasion Europe, India was seen as a resource to be extracted, not a population to be saved. The War Cabinet's view was that India, as a whole, should be self-sufficient, or, failing that, should contribute to the war effort without draining resources from the European theater. The famine in Bengal was seen not as a humanitarian crisis demanding an urgent response, but as a secondary, localized problem that must not be allowed to interfere with the primary goal of winning the war. One man in London did see the full horror of the situation: Leopold Amory, the Secretary of State for India. Amory, though a committed conservative and imperialist, was horrified by the reports he received from the new Viceroy of India, Lord Wavell. Wavell's cables were graphic and desperate, painting a picture of mass death on a scale that dwarfed military casualties. Amory began a relentless, one-man campaign inside the War Cabinet to secure emergency food aid for Bengal. He repeatedly petitioned the cabinet, begging for even a small fraction of the shipping and grain reserves available to the Allies. He argued that the famine was destroying Britain's moral authority and that the failure to act was a stain on the empire. He sent memos, made speeches in cabinet meetings, and confronted his colleagues, pleading for a few cargo ships of Australian wheat to be diverted to Calcutta. He was met with bureaucratic excuses, cold logic, and outright refusals. The primary obstacle was not just the shipping crisis. It was the unyielding will of the Prime Minister. Winston Churchill's personal views on India were the single greatest obstacle to saving Bengal. He held a deep, well-documented disdain for Indians, whom he viewed as a beastly people with a beastly religion. He particularly loathed the independence movement and its leaders, like Mahatma Gandhi, whom he saw as traitors. When Leopold Amory brought the desperate pleas for famine relief to the War Cabinet, he was met not with compassion, but with racist contempt. In one infamous War Cabinet meeting, Churchill reportedly snapped at Amory, asking why, if the famine was so bad, Gandhi had not died yet. On another occasion, he dismissed the starving millions by claiming the famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. He saw the famine as a necessary, if unfortunate, culling of a disloyal population. To Churchill, every ship and every ton of grain sent to India was a ship taken away from the war in Europe. He personally and repeatedly blocked Amory's requests, arguing that the war effort took precedence. His personal animosity ensured that the official policy would be one of fatal neglect. The plight of Bengal was not entirely unknown outside the British Empire. Reports of the staggering death toll reached President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the United States government. The American War Shipping Administration controlled a massive fleet of vessels and was aware of the vast grain surpluses in North America and Australia. The U.S. had the logistical capability to divert ships and provide the necessary emergency food aid that Churchill was withholding. However, the U.S. government ultimately refused to intervene directly with significant shipments. American priority was the Europe First strategy and maintaining the tightest possible coordination with the British military effort. Roosevelt was reluctant to engage in a political confrontation with Churchill over the internal affairs of the British Empire, especially at such a crucial point in the war. The requests made by some American officials to divert wheat to India were rebuffed, ensuring that the necessary food remained stockpiled or was shipped instead to Britain, North Africa, or for the eventual liberation of Europe. The silence from Washington was a geopolitical endorsement of Churchill's triage policy, leaving the starving without their best hope for relief. Among the few nations that had a readily available surplus of grain near the Indian Ocean theater was Australia. Australia, a committed member of the British Commonwealth, maintained vast stockpiles of wheat that could have reached Calcutta within weeks. The Indian administration, under Viceroy Wavell, made urgent, direct requests to Canberra to secure these Australian supplies. This was the most logical and efficient source of immediate relief, requiring minimal diversion of transatlantic shipping needed for the war. However, these requests were also effectively blocked by the British War Cabinet. Churchill insisted that Australian ships carrying food must be used either to replenish British strategic reserves or to maintain supplies for the military theaters. The grain was needed, Churchill argued, to ensure that Australia remained a stable staging ground for operations against Japan. Thus, millions of tons of food sat unused in Australian silos, while millions of Bengalis starved a mere few thousand miles away. The deliberate manipulation of global food policy to maintain British control and priorities acted as a fatal blockade of humanitarian aid. The situation was so dire and the administrative paralysis in India so complete that the British government was finally forced to install a new, powerful voice. Field Marshal Archibald Wavell was appointed Viceroy of India in late 1943. Wavell was a soldier, a realist, and a man who was genuinely horrified by the scale of the human tragedy unfolding before him. He was the first high-ranking official to use unvarnished, brutal language to describe the true nature of the famine to London. Wavell's arrival marked a turning point, not in the London policy, but in the internal British administration in India. He immediately bypassed the corrupt and slow local bureaucracy, using the military's efficiency and logistical capacity to begin organizing famine relief. He deployed the British Indian Army to distribute food and manage emergency kitchens. Wavell became the essential voice of conscience, though his desperate pleas to Churchill for the necessary shipping to sustain this effort were repeatedly ignored. The intervention orchestrated by Viceroy Wavell, while saving many lives, was ultimately a temporary and insufficient measure. Wavell successfully mobilized the British Indian Army, using its trucks and administrative framework to transport existing local supplies and distribute emergency rations to the worst-hit areas. The Pendowland Army's deployment restored some order to the chaotic food markets and broke the power of local hoarders, proving that a centralized, forceful intervention was both possible and necessary. However, the military could not create food where there was none. Their efforts were constrained by the fundamental reality: the total food deficit caused by the Japanese blockade, the denial policy, and the failed shipments from London and Australia. The military could manage the distribution of a small amount of relief, but they could not prevent the continued flow of death caused by the macro-level policy failures of the War Cabinet. The suffering only truly began to abate when the next local harvest arrived, which was too late for the millions already dead. By the time the Bengal Famine officially ended in 1944, the final death toll was staggering and remains a source of historical dispute, with credible estimates ranging from 2 to over 4 million people. The widely accepted figure of 3 million deaths makes the Bengal Famine one of the deadliest famines of the 20th century. The sheer volume of death left permanent demographic and economic scars on the region. The starvation primarily struck landless laborers, fishermen, and artisans, the poorest and most vulnerable segments of Bengali society, wiping out entire communities. Beyond the immediate loss of life, the famine led to widespread displacement, disease, and social breakdown. Many women were forced into prostitution to survive, and families were permanently shattered. The Bengal Famine fundamentally destroyed the illusion of the benevolent British Empire in India. It proved to the world and to the Indian independence movement that the welfare of colonial subjects was not merely secondary, but entirely dispensable when weighed against the strategic priorities of the British government. In the immediate aftermath of the famine, the British government, under pressure from public outcry and the Viceroy's own candid reports, established the Famine Inquiry Commission, led by Sir John Woodhead. While the inquiry's final report carefully avoided assigning direct culpability to the War Cabinet or Winston Churchill, it was damning in its assessment of the local administration's failure. The commission stated clearly that the famine was not inevitable and pointed to administrative failure, hoarding, and the government's failure to intervene in the market as primary causes. However, the report was a masterclass in deflection. It subtly shifted the primary blame onto local Indian administrators and the provincial government, shielding the London War Cabinet and its key decisions, particularly the refusal to divert shipping from Australia and North America, from serious scrutiny. This official narrative, designed to manage political damage, became the foundation for decades of historical silence, concealing the direct policy choices made at the highest levels of the British government. The Bengal Famine had profound and irreversible political consequences, accelerating the demand for Indian self-rule. The failure of the British administration to protect its subjects, and the blatant prioritization of British citizens and military reserves over Indian lives, served as irrefutable proof to Indian leaders that British rule was not only economically exploitative but morally bankrupt. The famine was a political turning point that galvanized public opinion. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru used the tragedy as a powerful moral indictment of the entire colonial system. The famine destroyed any remaining legitimacy of the British Raj and convinced many fence-sitters that full, immediate independence was the only path to survival and dignity. When Britain finally conceded independence in 1947, the legacy of the 3 million starved Bengalis was a major moral footnote, providing the ultimate ethical validation for the end of the British Empire in India. In modern times, the historical debate surrounding the Bengal Famine has focused fiercely on the personal culpability of Winston Churchill. Historians have moved past simply blaming local corruption or weather to focus directly on the War Cabinet's documented decisions regarding food diversion and shipping allocation. Scholars have cited internal memos and cabinet minutes revealing Churchill's direct personal hostility toward India and his repeated, explicit rejection of food aid requests. The consensus among many contemporary historians is that while the famine had complex roots, Churchill's intervention at the highest level of policy was the single most significant obstacle to relief, transforming a crisis into a catastrophe. This analysis suggests that Churchill's wartime moral compass was tragically selective, prioritizing the lives of Europeans over Asians. The debate continues to challenge the established narrative of Churchill as a flawless war hero, forcing a necessary, painful re-evaluation of his complicated and dark legacy. The Bengal Famine stands as a towering moral failure of the British Empire during its purported finest hour. The tragedy was not an act of God, but a result of deliberate policy choices. The military, denial policy, the refusal to control speculation, and the sustained, fatal obstruction of food relief orchestrated by the War Cabinet. The war against the Axis was won, but at the cost of millions of innocent lives lost to politically motivated starvation. This event reveals the profound irony of the Second World War. While fighting Nazism's ideology of racial superiority and mass murder, the British government enacted a policy that resulted in the preventable death of millions of its own subjects based on racial and strategic priorities. The famine remains Churchill's greatest moral stain, serving as a brutal, unforgettable reminder that even celebrated heroes can be responsible for atrocities of selective humanity.